He set the 5 envelopes on the kitchen table before his daughter came downstairs. He had been up since 4 in the morning, not because sleep had abandoned him the way it abandoned some old men, restlessly and without warning, but because he had wanted the quiet, the specific quiet of a house before the day makes its demands. He had made coffee in the dark and sat at the table and looked at the envelopes for a long time before he heard her footsteps on the stairs. Elinor was 54 years old, and she still sounded like a child coming down those stairs. He did not know how that was possible, but it was. Some things about your children remain permanently fixed in a version of themselves that time cannot quite reach. She appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown, saw the envelopes and stopped. "Dad," she said it the way she said most things, with her mother's particular directness, the quality of a woman who identified something that needed addressing and addressed it without the preamble other people used. "What is this?" "Sit down," he said. "I made coffee." She sat. She looked at the 5 envelopes arranged in a neat row. Each one had something written on the front in his handwriting, the careful, slightly slanted handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship when penmanship was something you were taught with patience and a ruler. Secret 1. Secret 2. Secret 3. Secret 4. Secret 5. "Are these for me?" she said. "No," he said. She reached for the nearest one. He placed his hand over hers, gently, the way you stop someone from touching something hot, not with alarm, with care. "No," he said again. She looked at him. He was 92 years old, and he had the specific face of a man who has lived long enough that the emotions no longer rush to the surface. They sit deeper, visible only if you knew where to look. She had spent 54 years learning where to look. "Then what are they?" she said. He picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. "Things you'll never need to know," he said. She laughed, the nervous laugh of someone who cannot tell if they are witnessing something meaningful or something worrying. "Dad, you can't just put things in envelopes and tell me I'll never need to know." "I can," he said. "I just did." Is this something I should be worried about?" He looked at the envelopes for a moment. "Some truths only move pain from one person to another," he said. "Sharing them doesn't make them lighter. It just distributes the weight to someone who didn't earn it." She was quiet. "One of those," he said, "almost ended my marriage, and another one changed your life without you ever knowing it." He picked up his coffee again. This time he drank it. "And I intend," he said, "to take all 5 of them with me." His name was Arthur Calloway, and he had been born in a town small enough to walk across in 20 minutes, and had spent his entire life in the same county, the same house for 47 years, the same church every Sunday until his knees made the pews unreasonable. He was not a man who attracted attention. This was not false modesty, it was accurate. He was the kind of man who showed up on time, kept his word, did what he said he would do, and generated the specific quiet approval of people who value reliability over personality. His neighbors trusted him. His colleagues had respected him. His children, 3 of them, though only Elinor still lived nearby, had grown up knowing that their father was not the kind of man who said things he did not mean or promised things he could not deliver. What they did not know, what nobody knew, what nobody had ever known, was what any of that had cost him. He had met his wife Catherine in the spring of 1958 at a dance in the town hall, where neither of them had particularly wanted to be. She had been brought by a friend who was meeting someone. He had been brought by a brother who was avoiding someone. They had found themselves at the same edge of the room, the edge reserved for people who attended social events out of obligation rather than enthusiasm, and they had talked for 3 hours without noticing the time. He had proposed 11 months later. They had been married for 61 years before Catherine died on a Tuesday afternoon in October with her hand in his, and the window open, because she had always liked the sound of wind in the garden. He had lived alone for 4 years since then. The envelopes had been his idea. Not immediately. He had spent the first 2 years after Catherine's death in the particular fog of grief that follows a long marriage, not the dramatic grief of sudden loss, but the accumulated grief of understanding how much of your daily architecture was built from another person's presence. The coffee she made, the way she moved through a room, the specific silence of a house that used to contain her and now contained only the memory of where she had stood. In the 3rd year, he had started writing things down. Not for anyone to read, just to externalize them, to take what had been living inside him for decades and give it a physical form, even if that physical form was a sealed envelope that nobody would ever open. The act of writing was the point, the act of containing them somewhere outside himself. 5 envelopes. 5 things he had carried for so long they had become part of the load-bearing structure of who he was. Things that, if removed, would change the shape of the building. The first secret had begun in the winter of 1971. Arthur was 27 years old and Catherine was 6 months pregnant with their eldest son, and they were living in a rented house with a heating system that required coaxing and a landlord who required avoiding. He was working as a junior engineer for the county, and doing it competently and without complaint, and with the specific efficient cheerfulness of a man who had decided that his circumstances were what they were, and complaining about them served no purpose. In February of that year, a letter arrived from the Whitmore Engineering Fellowship in Edinburgh, Scotland. He had applied 8 months earlier, before the pregnancy, before the circumstances had changed, in the window of a life where such things had seemed possible. He had applied, and then forgotten he had applied with the comfortable forgetting of someone who does not expect to succeed. The letter said he had been selected. He sat at the kitchen table with that letter for a long time. Then he put it in the drawer under the telephone, and he did not tell Catherine. He told himself he would think about it. He told himself there was time. He told himself that the right answer would become clear if he gave it space. He gave it 3 weeks. Then he wrote back declining the fellowship, and he put that letter in the post on his way to work on a Wednesday morning, and he did not think about it again for a very long time. That was the first secret. Not because he regretted it. He needed to be precise about that even now, even in the privacy of his own accounting. He had not spent 60 years in quiet anguish over the road not taken. He had built a good life. He had loved his wife with the particular love of someone who knows they chose correctly. He had watched his children grow into people he respected. But the choice had existed, and the choice had been made in silence. And nobody, not Catherine, not his children, not his brother, not anyone who had ever looked at his life and seen a man content with what he had built, nobody knew that there had been a moment when a different life had been entirely possible. The twist arrived 30 years later. He and Catherine had been clearing out the drawer under the telephone, the drawer that had accumulated decades of miscellaneous paper, the archaeological record of a household, when Catherine went quiet. He looked up. She was holding the fellowship letter. He had forgotten it was there. She read it in its entirety without speaking. Then she set it on the table and looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that required directness. "You never told me," she said. "No," he said. "You chose not to go." "Yes." She looked at the letter for another moment. "Arthur," she said quietly, "you never had to prove love by disappearing." He did not know what to say. "I know what you thought you were doing," she said. "I know you thought it was a gift, but if you had told me, if you had asked, I would have found a way. We would have found a way." He had thought about that conversation many times in the years since. Not with regret, with the specific education of a man who has learned something important about the person he spent his life beside. Catherine had not needed protecting. She had needed including. He had confused the two for 30 years, and she had forgiven him for it in 40 seconds. That was the first envelope. He had written it down not because the story was shameful, but because it was true. And because the truth of it, the way he had spent 3 decades believing he had given something to Catherine without ever asking whether she wanted it given that way, had taught him more about love than almost anything else in his life. He had not shared it with Elinor, because Elinor did not need to inherit his education. She needed to earn her own. The second secret was older than the first in the way that certain wounds are older than certain scars. It had happened earlier, but it had taken longer to understand. Arthur's younger brother was named Philip, and Philip had been, for most of their shared childhood, the kind of person who made everything more difficult and more enjoyable simultaneously. Louder than Arthur, quicker to anger, quicker to laugh, the specific volatility of a person who experiences everything at higher volume. Arthur had spent 40 years being the steady one, the older brother who sorted things out, who made the phone calls, who showed up when showing up was required. In 1983, Philip had asked to borrow $9,000. The specifics of why were complicated in the way that Philip's specifics were always complicated. A business venture, a debt, a situation that required resolving before it became a larger situation. Arthur had the money because he and Catherine had been saving it for an extension on the house. He gave it to Philip without telling Catherine about the extension plan, which meant he was keeping 2 secrets simultaneously, which was not a state of affairs he was comfortable with, but which he managed by telling himself that both situations would resolve. Philip had said he would return it within 6 months. He had not. A year passed. Arthur mentioned it once, carefully, and Philip's response had been the specific defensive deflection of someone who knows they owe something and cannot face the conversation required to address it. Arthur had not pressed further. He was not a man who pressed. He was a man who absorbed and adjusted and told himself that the relationship was worth more than the money. Then Philip disappeared. Not literally, not all at once, but gradually, in the way that people who owe you something sometimes disappear. Phone calls unreturned, visits declined, the slow erosion of contact until one day Arthur realized that 2 years had passed without a real conversation. He had told Catherine about the money at some point in the 2nd year. She had been quieter about it than he had expected, the quietness, he understood later, of a woman who had already suspected and was absorbing the confirmation rather than receiving a surprise. "What do you want to do?" she had asked. "Nothing," he had said. She had looked at him. "He'll come back when he's ready," Arthur had said. "And when he does, I don't want the money between us." Catherine had said nothing. 11 years later, Philip had come back. He arrived on a Tuesday evening looking smaller than Arthur remembered. Illness will do that. Reduce a person to a version of themselves that the people who knew them earlier find both familiar and frightening. He sat in Arthur's kitchen with the specific manner of a man who has practiced an apology so many times it has worn smooth. "I know," Philip had said. "I know what I did." Arthur had made tea. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Philip had said. "I just needed you to know that I know." Arthur had set the tea in front of him. "I know," he had said. They had talked about other things for 2 hours. Philip's health, his son who had grown up without knowing his uncle properly, the town, the weather, the ordinary conversation of 2 old men who have decided not to spend their remaining time on the things that divided them. Philip had died 14 months later. He had died, Arthur had believed for a long time afterward, without knowing that the forgiveness had been extended. Because Arthur had never said it explicitly. He had not announced it. He had simply moved past it, had made the tea, had talked about the weather, had shown up to the hospital in those final weeks, and sat beside his brother the way he had always sat beside the people he loved when they needed someone to sit. He had assumed Philip knew. Then Catherine had told him, 3 months after Philip's funeral, that she had written to Philip privately. A letter, sent a year before his return, that had told him simply that Arthur missed him, and that whatever had happened between them, Arthur did not want his brother to die believing he was unforgiven. Arthur had sat with that for a long time. "You wrote to him," he had said. "Someone had to," Catherine said. "He knew," Arthur said. "He knew," she said. "He came back because someone told him it was safe to." He had not been angry. He had understood, in the way that long marriages produce understanding that bypasses the need for explanation, that Catherine had done what she had done because she knew him well enough to know that he would not do it himself, that his forgiveness was real and complete and entirely unexpressed, and that Philip needed it expressed before he could return. She had expressed it for him. The second envelope contained that story. The story of a man who had spent 11 years forgiving his brother in complete privacy, and would have allowed his brother to die without knowing if his wife had not intervened. The lesson was not that silence was wrong. The lesson was that sometimes love requires a translator, and that he had spent 60 years married to his. If this story is reaching something in you like this video right now, 1 second, it puts this in front of someone who is carrying a forgiveness they have never found the words for. The third secret was the one that had cost him the most to write down. Not because it was shameful, because it was true in a way that the others were true at one remove, remembered, reflected upon, understood through the long lens of retrospect. The third secret was true in a different way. It was true in the way of something that had happened in real time, in a single winter evening, in the 4 minutes between opening the front door and closing it behind him. It had been 1994. 40 years into the marriage. He wanted to be precise about the circumstances because imprecision would make it seem more dramatic than it was, and the truth of it was that the drama was entirely internal. Nothing external had happened. There had been no argument, no confrontation, no event that a person looking in from outside would have identified as a crisis. Just distance. The specific, accumulated distance of two people who have lived together for so long that the living has become logistical rather than intimate, who pass each other in hallways and discuss schedules, and manage the household and fall asleep beside each other, and wake up and begin again without ever quite touching the thing underneath all of it. The question of whether they still chose each other actively, as distinct from simply continuing. He had packed a suitcase on a Thursday evening in January. He could not explain, even now, what had moved him to do it. Not another person, there was no other person. Not a plan, he had no plan. Just the impulse of a man who had been feeling invisible in his own life for long enough that the impulse had become an action before he had fully decided whether to act. The suitcase had been in the hallway. He had put on his coat. He had picked up his keys. And then he had looked through the kitchen window. Catherine was at the table. She had not heard him, or if she had heard him moving through the house, she had not come to find out what he was doing, which was its own kind of communication. She was folding laundry. His shirts specifically. She had a particular way of folding his shirts that she had developed early in the marriage and maintained for decades. The sleeves folded in first, then the body in thirds, a method so specific to her that he had never been able to replicate it satisfactorily. She was folding his shirts. Her face was tired, not unhappy, tired. The tiredness of a woman who had been carrying a great deal for a long time and had not recently been asked how the carrying was going. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he put down the keys. He took off his coat. He put the suitcase back in the cupboard under the stairs. He went to the kitchen, and he said nothing about what had just happened, and Catherine said nothing about what had just happened, and they ate dinner and watched the news and went to bed. He had never told her. He had told himself it was to spare her. That knowing he had stood in the hallway with a packed suitcase would have hurt her in a way that the moment itself did not deserve, because the moment had not in the end amounted to anything. He had stood there. He had left. He had returned. Nothing had changed. But something had changed. He had. Standing at that window looking at his wife folding his shirts, he had understood something that 40 years of marriage had not previously made legible to him. That love is not a feeling that sustains itself passively. It is a decision that requires renewal. And he had been failing to renew it, had been allowing the logistics to replace the decision, the schedule to replace the choice, until the absence of the renewal had become so pronounced that he had packed a suitcase without knowing why. He had come back. And then he had started choosing again, quietly, deliberately, in the small ways that are invisible to everyone except the person they are directed at. He had asked Catherine about her days more specifically. He had suggested the drives to the coast they had stopped taking. He had noticed the tiredness in her face and asked what it was for. She had not known why he had changed. He had not told her. That was the secret. Not the suitcase, the return. He had come back and chosen her again, and spent the remaining 20 years of her life choosing her every day with the specific awareness of a man who knows what he almost did. And she had never known. Until, 4 years after her death, he had been going through her journals, the small notebooks she had kept throughout their marriage, the private record of a private woman, and had found an entry dated January 1994. One sentence. Today I thought he might leave. I hoped he wouldn't. He had sat with that sentence for an hour. She had known. Not about the suitcase. He did not believe she had known about the suitcase, but she had felt the distance that had preceded it. She had felt him withdrawing, and she had sat at the kitchen table folding his shirts, and she had hoped. She had not asked. She had not confronted. She had simply remained and hoped. And he had looked through the window and seen her remaining and had come back to her. The third envelope contained that story. The story of a marriage that had survived not because it was perfect or because either of them was without fault, but because on a Thursday evening in January, two people had each, separately and without discussion, decided to stay. The fourth secret was not his. That was the thing that had surprised him most when he discovered it. That the woman he had spent 61 years believing he knew completely had been carrying something he had never suspected, had been carrying it with such quiet competence that not once in 4 decades had he detected even the outline of it. He had found out 3 months after Catherine died. He had been going through the filing cabinet, the one she had maintained with the careful organization of a woman who understood that someone would eventually have to sort through it, and had decided that someone should not suffer unnecessarily in the process. Folders labeled, documents dated, everything in the order a person who respected other people's time would leave things. In the back of the bottom drawer was a folder he had not seen before. It was labeled in Catherine's handwriting simply, "Managed." Inside were receipts. Years of receipts, going back to 1987. Receipts for household bills, for school fees, for repairs, for the kind of expenses that accumulate in a family and require management. He had known about most of them, had paid many of them, had been aware of the general financial picture of their life together. But there were others he had not known about. There were receipts from a jewelry valuation service dated 1989, from a resale shop he did not recognize, dated 1991, from another one, 1993. He had looked at these receipts for a long time without understanding them. Then he had understood them. Catherine had been selling her jewelry. Not dramatically, not in crisis. Piece by piece, over years, the pieces she valued less, the pieces she had inherited from relatives she had not been close to, the pieces that were beautiful but not irreplaceable. She had been selling them quietly and using the money to cover shortfalls in the household budget that she had not wanted to worry him about. He had known that money had been tight in certain years. The late 80s particularly, his company had gone through a difficult period, his salary had been reduced, they had managed. He had thought they had managed because they had been careful, because they had adjusted their expectations, because they had tightened what needed tightening. They had managed because Catherine had been selling her jewelry. At the bottom of the folder was a small note, not addressed to him specifically, not addressed to anyone, written in the present tense of a woman writing for herself rather than for a future reader. "He carries enough," it said. "This is not a burden, this is just what you do." He had sat on the floor beside the filing cabinet for a very long time. 61 years. 61 years of believing he understood the architecture of his own life, where the weight was, who was carrying what, how the balance had been maintained. And the woman he had loved for all of it had been quietly selling her pearls and her grandmother's bracelet, and a set of earrings he remembered her wearing to a Christmas dinner in 1985. And she had done it without drama, without announcement, without the slightest indication that she was doing anything more than the ordinary maintenance of an ordinary life. He carries enough. He had always believed he was the one who carried. He had believed this not from arrogance but from the genuine blindness of a man who had never thought to ask, who had understood himself as the primary weight-bearer, without considering that the weight-bearing might be more distributed than he knew. Catherine had not protected him from the truth to diminish him. She had protected him because she loved him in the specific way of a woman who understood that his pride was real and that certain wounds to it could not be undone, and who had decided that preventing those wounds was worth the cost. She had been right. He knew that now. He knew it with the peace of a man who has processed something fully and arrived at the other side of it. The fourth envelope contained her secret, not his. He had written it down because he felt it deserved to exist somewhere outside of a filing cabinet. Because the act of Catherine selling her jewelry and writing, "He carries enough," and asking for nothing in return was, he had come to believe, the most loving thing anyone had ever done for him. And she had never told him. And he was not going to tell Elinor. Because Elinor did not need to know that her mother had been more quietly magnificent than anyone had understood. Elinor had her own understanding of her mother, built from her own 54 years of knowing her. That understanding was hers. He was not going to add to it from the outside. Some gifts are given once. Some gifts are taken to the grave. He looked at Elinor across the kitchen table. The fifth envelope was in front of him. She had not reached for it again. She had understood, in the way that children eventually understand the limits their parents set, that this one was not for her either. "Just tell me," she said. "Tell me what it is. You don't have to give it to me, just say it." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. She laughed, frustrated, fond. The laugh of a woman who has been having this particular kind of conversation with this particular man for 50 years and knows exactly how it ends. "Dad. Elinor. Is it something terrible?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said. "Is it something I should know, for practical reasons? Health, finances, anything like?" "No," he said, "nothing like that." "Then what is it?" He picked up his coffee. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window now, the particular light of early spring, still thin, still uncertain, the light of a season that has not yet committed to itself. "I was happier than anyone knew," he said. She looked at him. "That's the secret," he said, "the last one." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her processing it, running it through the filter of whatever she had expected, measuring it against the anticipation the other 4 envelopes had built. "That's it," she said. "That's it. You're taking happiness to your grave." "I'm taking the fact of it," he said. "Yes." "Why?" she said. "Why would you keep that secret? Why wouldn't you want people to know you were happy?" He thought about how to explain it. "Because," he said slowly, "people spent a great deal of time over the years looking at my life and deciding what it meant. The sacrifices, the quiet, The years I spent building something that didn't look like much from the outside, and most of them decided it looked like a hard life. Elinor said nothing. And I let them think so, he said, not to deceive anyone, because correcting them would have required explaining things I didn't want to explain. The morning coffee, your mother in the garden, your brother's laugh when he was 7, the way the house sounded on Sunday afternoons when all of you were still at home. You cannot explain those things to people who have decided what your life looks like. You can only live inside them. He set down the cup. Happiness loses something when it has to defend itself, he said. I was not going to spend my life defending it. Elinor was quiet for a long time. So you were happy, she said finally. Profoundly, he said, quietly, without anyone's permission. She looked at the envelopes. What are you going to do with them? He stood up from the table. He took the 5 envelopes and carried them to the small fire pit he kept in the garden for yard waste. Elinor followed him to the back door and stood in the frame, watching. The morning was cold and clear. His breath made small clouds in the spring air. He put the envelopes in the fire pit. He lit them. He watched them burn, the careful words, the sealed years, the weight of 5 lifetimes of carrying. And he felt, as the paper caught and darkened and dissolved, the specific lightness of a man who has finally put something down. Not because the things inside them no longer mattered. Because they had already done their work. They had been lived. They had been felt. They had shaped him and the people he loved in ways that could not be undone and did not need to be. The burning was not erasure. It was completion. Elinor came to stand beside him. They watched the fire together in the cold morning without speaking. A father and a daughter at the end of something and the beginning of something else, in the garden of a house where a woman had once folded shirts and kept accounts and written, "He carries enough," in a folder labeled simply, "Managed." "Dad," Elinor said quietly. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you were happy." He looked at the last of the smoke, rising into the clear spring air. "So am I," he said. There's a version of old age that looks like subtraction, the slow removal of what made a life full, until what remains is simply the waiting. Arthur Callaway was 92 years old, and he had lost his wife and 2 of his closest friends, and the physical ease that had once made the world feel manageable. He had lost things that could not be recovered, and would not be pretended otherwise. But he had not lost the understanding that had arrived, slowly, across 9 decades, through sacrifice and forgiveness, and a suitcase that never left the house and a folder full of jewelry receipts, and a final secret so simple it had seemed, in the moment of its telling, almost insufficient. He had been happy. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in the way of a life without grief or failure or the specific regrets that accumulate when you are a person who makes decisions and lives with them. He had been happy in the way that is only visible from inside, the way that morning coffee and a woman's laugh and the sound of children in a house on a Sunday afternoon constitute a life so full that explaining it to anyone else would require them to have lived it. Some truths are simply places your heart once lived. Not every truth becomes wisdom when spoken. Some truths become wisdom simply because you carried them long enough. And then when the time came, you let them go. If this story stayed with you, if it found something you have been carrying quietly and not quite known how to name, please like this video. 1 second. It puts this in front of someone who is spending their life explaining their happiness instead of living inside it. Subscribe to Critical Hour. Every week there is a story here for the person who is still in the middle of something they haven't yet understood. Stories told from the end of a life that give you the clarity to live the middle differently. And leave me a comment. Tell me, what have you stopped trying to explain? What truth do you carry that would lose something if you said it out loud? Tell me. Because sometimes the thing you have been keeping in a sealed envelope is not a burden. Sometimes it is the most important thing you ever did. And sometimes the wisest thing is simply to let it burn.